Good afternoon, Chairperson. Again, I'm Christina Hosvet. I'm an attorney for DEM, and I have some preliminary questions for the witness. Mr. Horbert, where are you currently employed?
I'm employed at the Department of Environmental Management in their freshwater wetlands program.
And how long have you been employed with DEM?
I've been with DEM since August of 1998.
And what is your...
Excuse me, 1989.
What is your...
That long.
What is your current position?
I'm a supervising environmental scientist.
And as a supervising environmental scientist in the freshwater wetlands program, what are some of your responsibilities?
So I'm the program manager for that freshwater wetlands program, which entails basically managing the workflow throughout the program. I assign applications that come into the office to a staff of biologists and engineers for their review. I review their reports, I make decisions on applications, and probably most of my work is covered under other duties as required. Meetings, pre-application meetings, being aware of other freshwater wetland related happenings throughout federal agencies, for instance, testifying before boards, so a lot of different things.
And you're aware that the Efsb requested DEM to submit an advisory opinion in this docket?
I am.
And did you contribute to any portion of DEM's advisory opinion?
Yes, I did.
Specifically, the questions posed to DEM in its original advisory opinion were the impact on fish and wildlife that will be caused by disruption of habitat, and the impact of the proposed facility on state conservation priorities and plans, fish and wildlife habitats, and rare species, including those identified in the Rhode Island Natural Heritage Database. Did you contribute to those opinions?
Yeah, I was not involved in drafting most of that, but I did offer input with respect to any of those impacts that had to do with freshwater wetlands.
And that was only limited in respect to the wetlands, is that correct?
Correct.
And did you contribute to DEM's supplemental advisory opinion?
Yes, I did.
Specifically, in the supplementary advisory opinion, DEM was asked to discuss impacts of Invenergy's water supply plan and any other elements of the project, including new permit applications that have been added, updated, or modified since its original advisory opinion was issued. Did you contribute to that portion of DEM's supplemental advisory opinion?
Yes, I did.
And in what way did you contribute?
Again, I offered some input with respect to impacts on freshwater wetlands, as well as providing information on the status of any wetland application that was before my program.
And has Invenergy submitted an application to obtain a freshwater wetlands permit?
Yes, they did.
And who has been assigned as a supervisor for that permit?
I have.
All right. And as a supervisor assigned to that permit application, what is your role?
I basically assigned the application to technical staff and have been monitoring the progress of the review of that application through the program. I've reviewed a number of draft comments that have been issued during the review of that. Ultimately, I will be charged with making a decision on the application.
And are you familiar with the status of Invenergy's freshwater wetland permit application as it stands today?
Yes, I am.
And what is that?
It is currently off of our plate. We are awaiting comments on some additional supplemental wetland edge flagging that has been done on site to address what I understand is a relocated road access proposal.
And to be clear, the review process of that permit application has not been completed.
That's correct.
Right. And also to be clear, as you sit here today, you cannot render an opinion on whether or not Invenergy's freshwater wetland application will be either granted or denied.
That's correct. We're nowhere near that decision.
All right. And as it stands today, is Invenergy's freshwater wetland permit application, is that status significantly different than from August 15th, 2017, when DEM submitted its supplementary advisory opinion?
Not really. We've made a lot of progress in getting the information we need to ultimately complete our own evaluation, but we are still at the step of trying to get all the information we need in order to complete the application and issue a public notice.
In preparation for your testimony today, did you review DEM's advisory and supplemental advisory opinions?
Yes, I did.
And regarding those questions you contributed to in DEM's advisory and supplemental advisory opinions regarding impacts to fish and wildlife habitat as it relates to wetlands and the status of Invenergy's freshwater wetland permit application, has your opinions changed?
No, they have not.
I tendered the witness for examination on unlimited questions in DEM's advisory opinion and supplemental advisory opinions relating to impact to fish and wildlife habitat as it relates to wetlands and the status of Invenergy's wetland application.
Thank you. Other questions?
Before anyone questions, good afternoon, Mr. Horbert.
Good afternoon.
Could you just clarify for people when you say the permit is off our plate, what you meant?
So it is, we have kind of a clock. Whenever an application is actively on somebody's desk being reviewed, the clock is taken away with however many days that we have. And when we have completed a particular phase of a review, in this case, having issued comments that the applicant has to address, that comes off that clock and we move on to the many other applications we have before us.
Mr. Horbert, good afternoon. My name is Jerry Elmer. I'm an attorney for the Conservation Law Foundation. I believe you said in response to a question from your attorney that Invenergy's wetlands alteration application is not complete now as you sit here today. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Has Invenergy's wetlands alteration application ever been deemed complete by DEM between the time it was originally filed and today?
No, it has not.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
OER has no questions.
The town has a few. Good afternoon, Mr. Horbert. My name is Mike McElroy. I'm the attorney for the town borough. Thanks for coming.
Good afternoon.
Did I mishear you when your counsel asked you if a decision had been made yet? Did you say you were nowhere near that decision?
Correct. There's still quite a few steps in the process to go forward first.
Do you know when the application was first filed?
Yeah, it was first filed in April of 2017.
Now, we have you listed on our hearing schedule as testifying on the wetlands application, of course, but also on a number of other issues that are addressed in the DEM advisory opinions, including biodiversity, forest fragmentation, wildlife, water supply, fish and wildlife, and conservation priorities. Is it fair to assume that some of your duties and responsibilities relate to these areas as well?
Correct.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you some preliminary questions, and then I'm going to walk you through the DEM advisory opinions in a chronological fashion. And I'm going to introduce some areas to talk to you about. To the extent you're not the right person to be talking to about these areas, if you would just alert me to that and say I'm the wrong person, and maybe tell me who is. We have Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Gray, and Mr. Ozenkowski also coming in the future. So if any of those three gentlemen are the right person, you could direct me to them instead. Is that fair?
That's fair. I mean, as I indicated, I only provided input with respect to impacts only on freshwater wetlands and regulated freshwater wetlands. So any of the other impacts or opinions in that advisory opinion were handled by others in DEM.
All right. So we'll go through that. What I want to do is I want to start out. Could we bring up Burrillville Exhibit 43 and put it on the screen? you see that? Is it possible for you to read it?
No, my eyesight is horrible.
Could you make it bigger, please?
Which section?
Let's just start right at the very top. And just enlarge it as much as you can.
Oh, first off, I have a question. This is not the complete email. It doesn't contain the question that was posed to Mr. Horvath that he was answering.
No, it does not, but it is a full exhibit in this doc.
All right.
So, Mr. Horvath, this is an excerpt from an email dated July 30th, 2018, that you wrote to a Ms. Sloman, correct?
Yes, it appears to be.
Do you recall it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And this is an exhibit, Burrville 43, full in this case. And I want to ask you a few questions about it. In the first full paragraph, starting with the second sentence that begins, however, are you able to read that?
Yes.
However, we are obligated to make sure that any application to alter, and what's been filed by Invenergy is an application to alter, correct?
That is correct.
That any application to alter is quote-unquote complete before we issue a public notice. Completeness is further covered under Rules 7.07E and 7.08C. We don't want to send a project out for public notice and comment that is incomplete, incorrect, misleading, or missing key information. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And is that an accurate statement?
Yes, it is.
All right. Still an accurate statement today?
With the exception that those rule numbers have changed.
Okay.
The department has gone through a significant recodification effort to standardize rule numbering, so those rule numbers have changed.
But is the text of the reference rules the same?
It is.
Okay. And it has the same requirements as you've summarized here?
Correct.
You go on to explain the reasoning behind the rule, and it says there are two primary reasons for this. First, the DEM needs to be sure that all information we need in order to complete our evaluation and make a decision has been provided to us. Second, since the project also needs to be thoroughly understood by members of the public who wish to review and comment on the project, it is important for us to be sure that the material we send out or available in the file makes sense and includes information on all wetlands alterations being proposed. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Right. And is that still the reasoning behind these two rules?
Yes, it is.
And that's important to DEM, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
For both reasons. First, that you have all the information you need, correct?
Correct.
And second, so that the public has all the information so they can evaluate it and give you comments, correct?
Correct.
The email goes on to state, in this case, it has taken multiple requests to get all the information we need, many times requesting the exact same thing multiple times. And at this time, I am still not sure they have adequately responded even now. I am awaiting the results of our latest review. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
And do you have personal knowledge of the fact that multiple requests have gone out to get the information many times, asking for the same thing multiple times?
I do.
Could you give me some examples?
Yes, one of the examples is we have requested multiple times that the full details of the interconnection between the generation facility and the gas line, the source of natural gas for the facility, be provided on the site plans with the associated limits of disturbance and any alterations that are associated with that connection. And we've been making progress, but we have still not received those full details. So that's one example.
Do you have any other examples?
We requested a couple times for full details associated with exactly what is proposed in the staging area and laydown areas, as well as asking for details of exactly what types of alterations are associated with that, because it was not clear a couple times on the site plans as to what in fact they were proposing for temporary filling, whether they were using swamp matting or not, what their intentions were for restoring that area, things of that nature.
Is it unusual for DEM to have to take multiple requests to get all the information you need, many times requesting the exact same thing multiple times?
How I wish it was.
Okay, so that happens.
It happens frequently. Certainly not every occasion, not even half of the applications, but it does happen more than it should.
Makes your job harder, doesn't it?
It doesn't make it either more easy or more hard, but it does certainly add time to the reviews.
And now I'd like to look at the third paragraph where it says, and to be very clear, can you see that?
Yes.
It says, and to be very clear, DEM has so far not actually evaluated the merits of this wetlands application. We are merely making sure that we have everything we need, so that when we do perform our evaluation of the merits of the application, we will be able to complete it and arrive at a conclusion as to whether the applicant has met all of the review criteria in the rules. That's still the case?
Yes, it is.
It then goes on to say the evaluation will be done once the notice has been issued. And notice, it's a capital N on the notice. Can you tell me a little bit about the notice process and how that works?
Sure. That refers to the public notice. For any application to alter, once we have a complete application, we are required to provide a public notice which describes the project, provides copies of the site plan, the site plans of the proposed project, to all abutters within 200 feet of the proposed alterations, and to a number of city or town or state agencies or other non-governmental organizations that have asked us to provide copies of such notices. So that public notice is, once issued, runs for 45 days, during which time any comments that are received are put aside, and once the public notice is ended, we review whatever comments we may get, if any, and make a determination as to whether those comments are substantive or not.
And if there are substantive comments, what's the next step?
So if there are, and I think the term in the rules and law is objections of a substantive nature, if we do receive such an objection, then we are required to have a public hearing for the project before we can make a decision. Such hearing would have had to have been also authorized by the applicant themselves.
You're saying the applicant has to authorize the hearing?
Yeah, if we have to have a public hearing, the applicant not only has to authorize it, they have to pay for that hearing. If they do not authorize that, for us to go forward with a hearing within a certain time frame, the application is closed.
Assume that the notice goes out that a substantive objection or comment is filed, that the applicant authorizes the hearing. What kind of hearing is held? Is it an evidentiary hearing or some other type of hearing?
I don't really honestly know. It doesn't happen that often. I believe it's, I really don't know what the technical term is, but it's intended to obtain additional input or information on the application.
So will people be allowed to testify at the hearing?
Yes, and there would be a stenographer available to keep a record of that hearing.
And who would preside at the hearing?
Again, I don't know. The DEM would, and the DEM would through, I'm assuming, one of their attorneys or a hearing officer.
And after the hearing is over, what happens next?
So once the hearing is over, the DEM completes its evaluation of the project and issues a decision.
Okay. Is that decision appealable?
The decision, either for approval or denial, can be appealed, yes.
Would that be to Superior Court? Or would it be to somewhere else within the administrative process at DEM?
It typically appeals to something called the Administrative Adjudication Division within DEM.
And would there be another hearing at the Administrative Adjudication Division on that appeal?
Yes.
And after that hearing, a decision will be rendered by the Administrator of Adjudication?
Correct.
And would that decision be subject to appeal to the Superior Court?
I believe so.
So where do we stand in terms of a public notice being issued on this particular case?
I don't honestly know. We are still waiting to get responses to a comment with respect to the wetland edges. I anticipate shortly after that we will be awaiting a significant redesign of the proposed access roadway, which we have not had a chance to review yet. We'll have to make sure that everything that we need for that application and to go forward with our review is provided to us before we can determine that it's ready to go out to public notice.
When DEM is reviewing the freshwater wetlands application, and now I'm specifically concentrating on the proposed new so-called temporary access road, you're familiar with that?
Yes.
Will you be looking at the impacts of biodiversity on this site of the new temporary access road?
Well, we'll be looking at proposed proposed alterations and their associated impacts will be on freshwater wetlands. So to the extent that biodiversity impacts will result from impacts to wetlands, then we will be reviewing that.
Okay. So the short answer regarding the notice is that the notice has not yet been issued, correct?
That is correct.
Has a proposed mitigation plan been submitted to DEM?
Yes, it has.
And does that fall within your jurisdiction?
It's part of our application.
Part of the freshwater wetlands application. Has the mitigation plan been approved?
The mitigation plan is neither approved or denied. It's supporting documentation that's incorporated in the application itself. So if the project was approved, that would mean mitigation proposal was also approved.
Could you move your mic slightly closer to your mouth?
Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. Is that better?
Yeah.
Does your office work, well, let me back up. Would you agree that this project is also going to need a federal Section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers?
Yes.
And does your office work in conjunction with the Army Corps of Engineers in evaluating wetlands impacts?
My understanding, we usually do, but my understanding is that this particular application is being reviewed through an individual permit. So they're actually two entirely separate permitting processes. And there's not typically interaction between the two agencies other than monitoring each other's progress, and if they had questions of me or vice versa, just pick up the phone and talk about it.
Would you explain what it means to be evaluated pursuant to an individual permit versus some other method?
Yeah, Rhode Island, let me back up. The Army Corps of Engineers, New England District, has issued something called a general permit. We call it the Rhode Island General Permit. So for certain projects, generally those projects that involve anywhere from 0 to 1 acre of fill or impact within federally regulated wetlands, the definition which differs somewhat from the state regulated wetlands. We coordinate our review with the Army Corps, and in the event that the state agency issues a permit, that is also the Army Corps permit. They don't get a separate piece of paper from Army Corps. For any projects which are over an acre, or even for projects which are under an acre, that the Corps may exercise their authority to upgrade, it would go through an individual permit process, which is a whole separate permitting process that Army Corps deals with.
And so in this particular case, as far as you're aware, it's going through the individual permit process, correct?
That is how I understand it, yes.
Do you know, have you participated in any meetings or telephone conversations or exchange of emails with the Army Corps of Engineers on this project?
Yes.
And could you tell us the nature of those?
We were called to meet with Alex Kostra of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Mike Marsh of EPA, who are in the process of reviewing their application for this project. They had some questions about our process, which they really did not understand. They had some questions about how we looked at impact avoidance and minimization measures.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? How you looked
Impact avoidance and minimization measures.
Thank you.
In general, they're just curious as to where we were in our process. I'm assuming because they wanted to know how it was going to fit within their review process.
Do you know if they have a completed application at this time?
I do not know. My understanding is that they do not.
With regard to the Army Corps of Engineers, are they the designated federal agency that would make a determination as to whether or not this project would require an environmental impact statement?
I believe that's correct.
Have you had any discussions with them about what their considerations are as we sit here today with regard to whether they are going to require an environmental impact statement?
No,
Objection outside the scope of his testimony.
I'm sorry, I was writing down notes. What was the question?
The question was whether he's had any discussions with the Army Corps of Engineers about whether they're going to issue an environmental impact statement.
What's the objection?
Outside the scope of his testimony, he's here to testify about the DM's wetlands process and the status of the wetlands application, not about whether or not about an EIS.
Overruled.
No, I have not had any discussions.
So what we're going to do is what I mentioned earlier. I'm going to just start walking through the two DEM opinions from beginning to end. Did you bring them up there with you?
I did not.
No? I think they're going to be put up on the board for us, or our luck holds out. And I'll start with the original.
Would you also like a copy in
I
front
would
of you?
love a copy.
Okay. Can we get a copy of advisory opinion and the supplemental from DEM for Mr. Corbett?
So if we could look at page 9 of the original. So to put this into context, and again, my reminder that to the extent I ask you questions that are better deferred to somebody else, please just let me know, okay?
Sure.
So we're starting on page 9, and we're looking at questions that the Efsb has posed to DEM that they are seeking an advisory opinion on. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes.
And so at the top of page 9, there are two questions that have been combined together. The first is number 3, the impact on fish and wildlife that will be caused by disruption of the habitat. And the second one, number 6, is the impact of the proposed facility on state conservation priorities and plans, fish and wildlife habitats, and rare species, including those identified in the Rhode Island Natural Heritage Database, correct?
Correct.
Now, if you look at the first full paragraph of the opinion, it states that DEM has combined the two advisory opinions due to interrelated and overlapping content, correct?
Correct.
And basically what you're saying is this is essentially all one and the same, and so it's better to deal with it all as one, correct?
I'm assuming so. I did not write that particular statement.
But you've reviewed it before your testimony, and you're familiar with it, correct? So the first sentence under the word background says that the proposed project is located in a large, intact, forested area of high conservation value, correct?
Correct.
What is an area of high conservation value?
That would have to be answered by another member of DEM.
All right. Going to page 10. At the top, the heading says value of forests in the northwest corner. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about this. It says the value of the interior forest in the northwest corner of Rhode Island has been known to DEM for decades. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that that's what this says, yes.
All right. It goes on to say that large undeveloped tracts of land and corridors to connect those tracts of land are vital to the conservation of biodiversity. Fish and wildlife rely on habitat connectivity to find scarce resources, preserve gene flow, and locate alternatives to lost habitat. Do you agree with that?
I agree, yes.
Now, it goes on that same page to talk about DEM's land acquisition plan from 1996. Do you see that in the large middle paragraph?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that plan?
No, I am not.
Okay. The quotes that are attributed, or that are quoted from the plan then, at the bottom of this page, you're not familiar with those?
I have reviewed them, but I was not one that was involved in drafting these.
All right. Well, let's just take two quick looks and see how you feel about this. The first sentence of the quote says, the continuity of the primarily forested landscape in this focus area provides the spatial requirements of a number of species that rely on large habitat tracts. Do you agree with that?
To the extent that that's what was evaluated on what I'm assuming is the report of 1996, yes.
All right. And the third paragraph states at the beginning, particularly within this focus area, preventing fragmentation is of critical importance to perpetuating the native biological communities and reducing the level of homogenization of species assemblages brought about by reduction in forest patch size. Do you agree with that?
Again, to the extent that that's what it said in the report, but in general, yes, I agree with that.
All right. Now, if you could look at the bottom of page 11, please. The final paragraph talks about DEM's 2010 Conservation Opportunity Area, also known as COA mapping. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
All right. You familiar with that?
No, I am not.
Okay. Who would be familiar with that?
Probably Jay Ozenkowski.
Okay. The bottom of that page makes a reference to the wildlife corridor associated with Iron Mine Brook and its Palestrine thank you very much, forested wetlands traversing the portion of the site in which the majority of clearing and wetlands impacts for the facility are proposed. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
The next page, please, page 12. Right in the middle of the page. It says, reasonable conclusions are that substantial forest clearing and fragmentation from the project will negatively impact area-sensitive wildlife and plants in the site vicinity, and that at a broader spatial scale, this project will inhibit DEM's attempts to enhance landscape resiliency, to mitigate the loss of biodiversity through habitat fragmentation and climate change. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. I was not involved in the drafting of that, so and this does not specifically relate to impacts on freshwater wetlands. But yeah, clearing of large forest habitat would have such effects.
Could we go to page 18, please? Now this section, let me let you get there. You there? This section is right in the middle of the page, and the heading says impacts on habitat from invasive species. Is that you, or should I ask these questions in this area of someone else?
Again, probably more appropriate to ask Jay Ozenkowski of that.
Mr. Ozenkowski. Would you, I mean, you've been with DEM for about 30 years, correct?
Just about, yeah.
Yeah. So, would you agree with at least the first sentence here, and I'm not trying to get you to work outside your area, but would you agree that invasive species are one of the most ubiquitous and severe threats to wildlife in their habitats?
It is a pretty significant impact, yeah, it's certainly one of concern.
I'll hold the rest of this section for Mr. Ozenkowski then. Page 19, please. So the heading that we're looking at is Site Inventory and Biological Survey. Do you see that?
Yes.
Is this an area that you're comfortable testifying in, or should I hold this for somebody else?
I believe you should hold it for somebody else. Again, this was all drafted, not specific to freshwater wetlands.
Do you know if the best person would be Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Gray, or Mr. Ozenkowski?
I would assume it would be Mr. Ozenkowski.
All right. I will hold these questions for him. Let's take a quick look at page 20 and see if this was within your area, down at the very bottom. It's talking here about vernal pools, also known as special aquatic sites. I assume that's something from the Freshwater Wetlands Act. Would you be comfortable talking about that?
Yes, I would.
All right. So, the bottom of this page, I'm going to stop. Talks about two small man-made depressional fracture features were discovered within the footprint in the spring of 2016. These were observed to contain a relatively marginal number of spotted salamander egg masses, although a precise count was not provided. As such, the two pools meet both the definition in the current rules and regulations for special aquatic sites and the definition in the recently revised Rhode Island Freshwater Wetlands Act for vernal pools. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
So, am I correct in understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a special aquatic site is essentially the same as a vernal pool?
Pretty much, yes.
And what is your understanding of why vernal pools or special aquatic sites are important?
Well, they're important because they provide important breeding habitat for certain amphibian species and certain aquatic insect species. And they're important because in a typical year, not every year, but in a typical year, they will dry out completely at some point during the year. They therefore do not typically support any populations of fish, which is important because if there was enough water in these sites to support fish, fish would certainly be a significant predator on both amphibians and their eggs, which would lead to unsuccessful breeding. So without pools that actually dry up at some point of the year, and amphibians such as spotted salamander or wood frog or marble salamander would not be able to successfully breed and continue their population.
Is it fair to say that under the freshwater wetlands regulations, it's important to DEM to the extent possible to try to preserve vernal pools and special aquatic sites?
Correct.
The opinion goes on to say at the top of page 21, line 2, according to the applicant, Special Aquatic Site 1 would be completely filled. And you understand by filling it, that would destroy it, correct?
Correct.
And the upland habitats directly adjacent to Special Aquatic Site 2 will be cleared for installation of the project's stormwater basin and a temporary construction staging area. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Have you received any information that would change either the destruction of Special Aquatic Site 1 or the impacts on Special Aquatic Site 2?
No, I have not.
It goes on to say that it is clear that the individual animals that utilize these pools will be negatively impacted. You agree with that?
Yes, I agree. But that sentence does continue and is relevant to that statement because it's not clear yet at this point whether or not there are sustainable populations in those pools.
All right. So let's just read the rest of the sentence. I'll read the sentence in its entirety. While it is clear that the individual animals that utilize this pool will be negatively impacted, the applicant has not provided sufficient information to determine if the pools are supporting a sustainable amphibian population. Correct?
Correct.
And as we sit here today, is that still the case?
That is correct.
Now, the next section is quoting from Invenergy's application. There are 3 bullets that deal with adverse impacts to wildlife, such as birds and bats that may collide with the facility, predation of avian nest sites, and opportunistic predators. Are these within your area, or should I ask them of someone else?
To the extent that the alterations that may result in these impacts are as a result of freshwater wetlands impacts, we would be looking at these factors.
Well, let's just, I don't need to read them into the record. Would you take a look at the 3 bullet points and tell me if any of these 3 bullet points fit within that?
So the first bullet point would probably not. I'm not aware of any structures that are actually proposed within freshwater wetlands.
Okay.
With the exception of some of the utility poles along the Burville Interconnection Project portion of that proposal. We would be evaluating the potential impacts of avian nest predation as a result of, for example, the clearing associated with the access road or any clearing within the 50-foot permanent wetland of the swamps that are on site.
And with regard to that second bullet, one of the things you'll be looking at is the negative impacts, if any, on the state-threatened black-throated blue warbler.
To some extent, although the impacts that would potentially happen with the black-throated blue warbler are primarily as a result of the upland impacts of the project.
And what about the third bullet?
So again, with the extent, with respect to these impacts resulting from the impacts in alterations to the permanent wetland, also known as a buffer zone, and the alterations associated with the roadway, we would be including such effects or impacts as part of our evaluation of the wetland impacts.
All right, and after summarizing these 3 points, the opinion states the latter 2 points are important, given that the project will clear a large area of forest within the middle of a larger area of intact forest that supports breeding of the state-threatened black-throated blue warbler, and that this area of clearing will also be connected to other existing cleared areas from 3 different directions. 1 westward to the existing power line cut, 2 northward to the existing compressor station and gas line cut, and 3 eastward to the roadway, this potential increase in nest predation is a significant concern, correct?
That is, yeah, correct. You asked me whether that's what that says.
Is that not within your area?
Most of those impacts are actually not. Most of those impacts are as a result of clearing within upland areas.
Right. Would you agree with me that clearing that results in an increase in nest predation is a significant concern?
Yes, I would agree that such is a significant concern.
Let's look at page 22 if we can. We're moving on to the summary and conclusion. Right in the middle of the page, it states DEM does not believe there is sufficient evidence in the application to support the statement, and then it quotes a statement from Invenergy. Quote, "The application has already been designed to minimize impacts to forested habitat areas," end quote. And there's a citation to Invenergy's response to DEM's third set of data requests. Do you see that?
I see that, yes.
And is that DEM's opinion? Does that remain DEM's opinion?
That remains DEM's opinion, yes.
Now going to the final paragraph on that page, it states, beginning with the second line, the second sentence, "As illustrated by the most recent plans, the majority of the ecological impacts from the facility will occur in upland areas outside the scope of the wetlands permit and outside of the jurisdiction of DEM's Office of Water Resources, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Further, since the majority of impacts relate to permanent loss of interior forest, they would be exceedingly difficult to mitigate despite a good faith effort to do so." Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did?
All right, so let's talk first about the DEM opinion. And does that remain DEM's opinion?
I believe it does, yes.
So let's talk about the first part of this, which is that the majority of the ecological impacts will occur in the upland areas outside of the jurisdiction of DEM or the Army Corps of Engineers or EPA. And the upland area impacts are not something that DEM can address through its wetland permitting process, correct?
Correct.
Doesn't mean they're not potentially severe impacts that could be addressed. They just can't be addressed by you in the context of your freshwater wetland permit, correct?
That is correct.
And you understand that the statutory charge to this board, by that I mean the Energy Facility Siting Board, is to determine whether or not the proposed projects presents an unacceptable harm to the environment, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And that charge is not limited to only wetlands, is it?
I do not believe so.
Okay. So, although DEM in its wetland permitting basically can't do much about anything in the uplands, certainly this board can consider harm to the uplands, correct?
I believe it does, yeah.
And you've pointed out some of those upland harms, haven't you?
Within this advisory opinion, yes.
Yes. Now the second part of this, at the bottom of page 22 and going over to the top of page 23, says the majority of the impacts relate to permanent loss of the interior forest, and they would be exceedingly difficult to mitigate despite a good faith effort to do so. Can you explain why that's the case? Or should I ask somebody else?
That, again, that part of the opinion was primarily drafted by for J. Ozenkowski.
All right, I'll ask him. In the second paragraph, beginning on the third line, no, we've covered that. I'm going to move on. The final paragraph on page 23, starting in the second line, it says, "Rhode Island has prioritized and invested in this area for wildlife conservation for decades. The location of the facility of this size and scope immediately adjacent to substantial acreage of state holdings of conservation land is not consistent with the conservation priorities that informed these state conservation plans. Do you agree with that?
I'm not familiar enough with those plans to have an opinion on that.
All right. DEM has not withdrawn its opinion in this regard, has it?
No.
All right. Who's the best person to ask about this?
Mr. Osenkowski.
Osenkowski. He's going to be a busy guy.
Sounds
Mr.
like it.
McElroy, before you get to the supplemental, inevitably, I just wanted to ask a couple questions too, because this came up earlier. We had a witness for the town, Mr. Zemba, and I just wanted you, for the sake of the board, he talked about the protections for upland habitat being anemic. That was the word he used in Rhode Island. And is it fair to say that our freshwater wetlands laws provide the strongest protection for rare species habitat in the state?
My understanding is that they're the only protection right now for rare or endangered species in the state. If they are not wetland species, they are not protected.
Unless they're federally listed as threatened or endangered.
Correct.
Why? And then there were some questions. In fact, the chair made one about wetland habitats versus other habitats. Why are they afforded a higher level of protection? So I think, for the sake of the board, if you could explain why wetland habitats have, since the 70s, had significant protections when uplands haven't. What makes them special?
Well, I can certainly speak to wetlands. I'm not sure I can talk very intelligently about the values of upland.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking about wetlands. And
well, yeah, wetlands are areas that are really transitional between upland areas, true upland areas, and water, standing water, flowing water. So they are hooked into things that are very important to the general well-being of our population, such as clean water, such as providing recreational and protecting clean water to support recreation, whether it be canoeing or hunting or educational opportunities. While there are no necessarily protections other than federal protections for rare species, at least for Rhode Island, most of the rare or endangered species that are listed rely upon wetlands for at least some portion of their life cycle. And historically, wetlands were considered wastelands, not really good for anything, and they were filled in or drained to provide quote-unquote productive habitat or productive farmland or space to build on. Because they had so many problems, they were the cheapest land to buy. And so there was undue pressure on freshwater wetlands, not just in Rhode Island, but throughout the country. And I believe that's really what drove protection of freshwater wetlands as opposed to protection of all kinds of different habitats.
thank you. I think I had one other question. Let me glance at this. Oh, I know what it was. We also talked a lot about the biological inventory that Invenergy had done by ESS this morning. In terms of the wetlands application, this advisory opinion says you don't have adequate information on whether there's sustainable levels, sustainable populations of amphibians in the vernal pools and such. Has DEM subsequently received the biological information that you need on wetland-dependent species to review for the wetland permit?
Well, there's two aspects to that. We have received a lot of information on inventory, and under our program, we don't ask the applicants to go to the nth degree to provide a complete biological inventory, but they do need to provide us enough so that we have something to go on our own evaluation. The other part of that is we will be doing our own assessment of the wetlands in the area, our own assessment of what wildlife may be using or could potentially use that habitat as part of our evaluating the impacts of the project on those wetlands. So, with respect to those vernal pools, we will be making a concerted effort to look at the characteristics of those vernal pools to determine whether or not they actually are supporting or could support a population of amphibians. Especially for special aquatic sites that aren't very deep and don't necessarily hold water for a long time. We find sometimes that even though they're regulated by us, they could actually turn out to be population sinks, where the younger the year species are walking around trying to find some place to breed. They find a pool, and they breed in that pool, and they lay their eggs, and they go on their merry way. But the pool dries out before those eggs can ever develop. They don't know that. They're just trying to propagate. If that frequently turns out to be the case, then you have a pool that attracts species, because there are certain portions of the population of any new population that doesn't return to the same pool that it was born in, over time you're not reproducing that population because the water's just not there long enough. At this point, we have no idea what characteristics these vernal pools have, and whether or not they are a sink or whether they're a productive habitat.
And spring is coming.
And spring is coming.
When
That's what they say anyway.
when would DEM scientists be going out to take a look at that?
Well, they've been out there several times already. I've actually been out there at least once to these specific areas. And we will certainly be going out there at least one or two other times, both as part of reviewing the revised project, and again to do our own detailed evaluation of the entire proposal once the project goes out to public notice.
But won't you have to, in order to evaluate a vernal pool and whether it's a sink or it's a productive habitat, won't you need to go out specific times this spring?
Ideally, we would like to do that, yes, but we cannot, for example, hold up. I mean, this is a problem with any application that we have before us. We don't get to pick the time that an applicant submits their application, and we're under timelines to review these applications. We don't always get out to these areas at the optimal time. So, yeah, ideally, we'll hopefully be out to these sites at the optimal time to make those determinations. If we are not able to, then we rely upon whatever notes or other characteristics that we have been able to observe when we've been out there.
And do you also look at other resources like the State Wildlife Action Plan or inventories by the Nature Conservancy or other organizations?
We look at anything we can get our hands on, yeah.
Thank you.
Could you look at page 34, please? And I'll let you get there. The topic is cumulative impacts of forest fragmentation. Should that be